Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Nicole and I'm going to be talking about two books that I read this week, but I'm also going to be sharing with you some other books that you might want to read if you've liked these books. So it's going to be a little bit of a book review, book recommendation, and if you liked this book, read these other books. So let me go ahead and get started. I'm really excited to talk to you about both of these books. I'm going to start with one that was a buddy read, and that is Palace of Desire. This is book 2 in the Cairo trilogy. I am buddy reading this with a friend. Now, because it's book 2, I'm not going to go into the specifics of what happens in this book, but I will tell you some about what the series is about, and of course I'll share with you what my thoughts were on the book in general. So the Cairo trilogy itself is following a family in 1940s. I always forget the exact time period, but I'm pretty sure it's the 1940s Egypt, when Egypt is just on the verge of gaining its independence. It's going through the process of that. And in the midst of that turmoil, we are invited inside into the very intimate and personal life of a single family. And in book 1, we start with that family with the father and the mother and their 4 kids, 5 kids. I actually had to count. And we get to see what their life is, what their faith is like, how the women live, how the men live, how they spend their days, and even how they spend their nights. It is a really interesting story. The whole trilogy, like I said, is a family saga, and it was actually inspired by the Forsyte Saga by John Galsworthy. So there's recommendation number 1. If you like this book or this series, you should read the Forsyte Saga. And if you like the Forsyte Saga, you should try this series. Now, to get specifically into what this book is about, we are welcomed into book 2, and I will tell you from personal experience, if you're going to read this series, I would not read book 1 and book 2 too far apart, because book 2, while not picking up right where book 1 left off, it does pick up just 5 years later with the same exact characters and the assumption that you remember quite a few details about what happened at the end of book 1. So I read book 1 2 or 3 years ago and kept trying to come back to book 2 and never did that successfully because I always kept going, oh, I don't exactly remember who's who and that kind of thing. And so this time in January, I read book 1, and then I came back to book 2 in March. Is that when you're seeing this? I don't know. Whatever month this is that we're in, that's when I came back to book 2. So just a couple months apart, and that worked really well for me. I was able to get right back into the book, and I even noticed a few little differences, if you will. But we'll get to those in a moment. First, I want to talk about, I think the topics in this book that I do feel like I could share without giving any spoilers away or anything like that. So let me pick up my little notebook and look. Oh yeah, I can also tell you a little bit about what this book is about just in terms of its themes. I think this book in general is discussing the idea of growing up and change that happens over time. So if those are topics that interest you, I think that may give you some idea of where this book goes without giving it away if you've read the first book, and may just give you an idea of whether or not you want to continue on with book 2 if you've read book 1. This also talks a lot about colonialization and culture, both the practical and mental aspects of that. I think you see that in both books, but I think it becomes a lot more prevalent in this book. You get a lot of discussion about the differences that there are in generations, because you are still with the same family, but of course, because it's 5 years later, everybody in the family has gotten older, and you get a sense of how Egypt itself is changing by watching this family change. And I think that is the last thing that I would say really stood out to me in this book, is just the amount of discussion there is about the people of Egypt at that time, their relationships to each other and to their country, as well as their changing and growing relationship with foreigners in their country and those who are abroad. And so, yeah, I really enjoyed this book. I think there were a lot of things in it that were really well done. For me, I think one of the biggest highs was probably the writing style, I would say, which brings me to something that I noticed because I read the books so closely together, is that their writing style in this book does change a bit. So I think you should be aware of that. I really enjoyed the writing style in the first book, but one of the things that I felt like made the first book a little hard to get into was because you had to slowly over time figure out exactly who the characters were and whether you liked them or not and why they were acting the way they did. It wasn't given to you right away, which I liked by the end of book one, but it really made me hate a couple people at the beginning of book one. And so that's why I say it was kind of hard to get into. In book two, though, right off the bat, I noticed that we're being told more about the characters' motivations. And that can be a good or bad thing. I think it makes it a little easier to get into book two, but by book two, you do know all the characters really well, so I don't know that it was necessary at this point. I almost wish it had have maybe been a little bit reversed. I don't know. But like I said, the writing style is also different in this. You get a lot of different points of view in this book, more so than you did in book one. And I think they're handled very well, whether it's first person, second person, or third person, and you do go through them all. And I think our author handled all of those points of view really well, and the transitions were smooth. That was one of the things that my buddy reader and I both talked about. And I still liked his writing, all except for one point of view, which was there was one character in this book where every time we went back to his point of view, I did not like it. And we actually spent quite a bit of the book in that person's point of view and in their story. I feel like in book one, you spend a lot of time or maybe more time with the father, but I feel like by and large you kind of cycle through most of the family pretty evenly. In this book, that is definitely not the case. That has gone away. I feel like this book did kind of fall into that trap of when you have multiple points of view. Okay, we're back. Rude, my camera died. Hopefully the last thing I was saying is that in Palace of Desire, it did fall into the trap that you had multiple points of view and that sometimes you end up finding that there's one point of view that you like more than others, or that there's one point of view you really don't like. And that happened to me. Mileage may vary. You may like the one point of view. It was, interestingly enough, the writing style in that point of view that I really found put me off the most. It became a first person sort of stream of consciousness style that existed a little bit in the first book. But to me, it felt like somebody mentioned in the first book that they liked the stream of consciousness that he did there. And so he just went all out with it in this book with that one point of view. And I'm not always a fan of stream of consciousness. I can be very picky about it and whether or not I like it. This was a situation where it wasn't working for me. And I just felt like that person's point of view was just dragged out way too long. And I do feel like it's probably because that was the character that it seemed like the author was connecting with the most, or maybe was representing the author's experience. Like that was the impression I got. I need to go and find my hardcover edition that has an intro and read what the intro says about this book, because that would probably clarify that for me, because that was the only way that I could understand as to why we were getting so much from that character. I mean, there were other reasons as well. I felt like that character was also representing how Egyptians felt towards their country and that kind of thing. But again, it was so drawn out and I didn't like how it was done that it brought the book down to like a 3.5 star for me, which is sad because I really enjoy the first book. And has it made me a little less excited about book three? Yes, because I'm afraid that we're gonna spend a lot of time with that character again, but we'll see. I mean, they're hopefully going to age again and maybe he'll grow out of it. There is the potential for that. So yeah, that was this book. I would recommend it to anybody who liked book one. I do think it's worth going on to. I definitely think it was a personal preference thing that made me not like book two as much. I could definitely see somebody who likes literary fiction enjoying that part a lot more, especially if you like postmodern fiction. That was a style that that particular point of view felt like to me, which is really interesting because this wasn't written in a time period where postmodern writing was really at the forefront of things. So take that for what you will. I also think this is a good book, of course, for anybody who likes a good family saga. I think this book would work well for you. I already mentioned one book that this is like, or one series that this is like. I think if you want another book that this at least made me think of, that would be The Parisian. This is by Isabella Hammad, and it is about a young man who is from Palestine who takes a few years and he is able to go and study in, I believe, Paris, France during World War One. And he goes off, he spends time there, and then he comes back to Palestine and is trying to grope with the change in himself and the expectations that are there for him from his family as Palestine is going through a time where they are seeking independence as a country. So I think you can see some of the overlaps just in terms of countries seeking independence and that sort of like, what do you think of your own country, as well as this experience of colonialization and foreigner and who's the foreigner and that kind of thing. And also, I think if you've read Palace of Desire, there will probably be even a stronger connection with this book. But I won't mention that because I don't want to get into any of the plot of that book. Okay, so that'll move me on to the second book that I have to talk to, that I'm going to talk to you about. I don't have to, but I want to. And that will be Native Son. Hopefully, if I've timed this correctly, by the time you are seeing this book review, I will have already met for my book club with my channel members. If not, and you're in my book club and you don't want to know what my thoughts are on this before we meet for book club, just skip this part. But anyway, I read Native Son by Richard Wright. This is the second book club pick for my members book club, and we read this in the month of February and March. In all honesty, I was hoping to start this at the end of February. Did I actually manage that? I don't think so. I think I just got it started at the beginning of March just because of the timing of how things worked out, and I tabbed this baby up. This is the second work that I have read by Richard Wright, and yeah, I have so many things to say about it, but let me get you like sort of the bare bone description of it. This was published in 1940s. It is a classic. I would say it fits somewhere on the line of like realism and historical fiction and magical realism, though I don't feel like that's the best term for it, but I'll talk about that when we get to it. On the surface level, this book is about a young man named Bigger Thomas. He is growing up poor in the south side of Chicago in the 1940s, as I mentioned, and he is just struggling to survive there. He is in a position where he is of age to be working, but he is struggling with the idea of what is available to him to work at in life, and he's finding himself just being tempted to commit crimes with the local gang. And he, as well as his family and pretty much everyone around him, realizes that his likely fate is just prison. And then at one point, he finds himself in a situation where horrific events happen to and around him, shall we say, that end up sending him in a trajectory and towards an inevitable end, is what it feels like in some ways. And this story is ultimately about why he is the way he is, why he acts the way he does, and what his life actually means in the grand scheme of things. This is a really well-written book. It has a lot of deep meaning in it, and it covers a lot of different topics, including the place of fear and guilt in society and how those occur. It is a book that definitely talks about the Black experience in the United States during the 1940s, and really even today. It is about the world and the opportunities in life and the opportunities that are provided for some, but not all. There's definitely a lot in here about the haves and the have-nots. And at its heart, it is about the meaning of life and man's desire to strive to live at pretty much any cost. And I definitely think you see that happen as you learn and hear and watch Bigger's life unfold. There are a lot of good things to like about this book. I think for me, some of the pros that I found had to do with just the exploration of the inner life of this character. It is definitely not just a character study, but I would say a psychological character study where we are spending a lot of time seeing things from his point of view. In fact, we see everything from the protagonist's point of view. And we really get deep insight into his mind, into his motivations, into how and why he's making these decisions as best as he knows how and why. Like, I wouldn't say it's a psychological book in terms of psychology, in terms of like he's self-diagnosing or anything like that, but we're really following his interior life and thoughts and emotions as well as he's able to express them. I think in this book, Richard Wright also does a really good job of incorporating the various ideas he has and the various historical events that were really happening around him into a really engaging and at times horrifying plot. I remember somebody was saying, like, oh, if you're around page 70, just wait. And they were like, it goes downhill from there or something like that. That was the biggest understatement. Like, if you read this book, read to page 70 and then keep going, because trust me, the wheels come off and you don't even know what to think for a very, very, very long time. But I'm glad I kept going. And at one point, like, I couldn't help but continue on. I mean, it is a really gripping plot line. It's well paced, and I think that helps you get to and through all the really hard moments and fascinating and hard discussions that come up in this book. I think if there's any cons in this book, it would be that there were times where I felt like that there was a message that Richard Wright was trying to share, but there was a real struggle to get it across. And in fact, Richard Wright himself even talks about how, as a writer, there is a struggle to take your emotions and what you're feeling and how, and the emotions that you want your readers to experience and convert those into words. And he has an essay where he describes like just how difficult that is, and I can appreciate that. But at the same time, I feel like there were times earlier on in the book where I did clearly understand the message, and I thought it was pretty well presented, like what the message and the point was and what I was supposed to experience and get out of the book. But then at the very end, when he tried to say it, I don't know, in a fancy banner, it got confused and garbled, both by the protagonist as well as by another person in his life. And that brings me to the second thing that I thought was kind of a con in this book is that I feel like the climax of the book kind of centers around a side character, is what it feels like. And they're the one who delivers and has the climactic moment in some ways. They definitely have the most like intense and powerful speech in the book, and it's not who I expected it to come from, which I don't think is a problem. But I think the reasons that the author did that are unclear, and it's also unclear initially how you as a reader are supposed to feel about what this person said, because I can say I personally didn't agree with everything they said, which can be fine and can happen. But for me, when I read what the author's intent was, it made me feel like he kind of missed the mark in like the last like maybe 60 pages of the book, which is a shame because that takes you through some of the most meaningful parts of the book. Now, was it a total miss? Absolutely not. I still gave this book like 4.5 stars. I really like it. And I would say if you read this book and you want a lot more clarity, this edition that I have of it comes at the very end with an essay that is written by Richard Wright. It's only 30 pages, and it's called How Bigger Was Born. And Richard Wright literally walks through on every single angle and way how he came about writing this book and creating the character Bigger Thomas. And I think that essay is really important to read just in terms of truly understanding like where the author was coming from and what he was trying to do. And even he acknowledges that beyond what he shares, that there are probably other things that are in the text that even he wasn't aware of, and that he's aware of that, and that maybe that's okay, but that he can only comment on the things that he's aware of having put in the text. So I think it's a really nice essay to have in there. I think it prevents that idea of death of the author, and it keeps him very alive in this book. And the idea of being alive is very important. And if you read this book, you would know that. I mean, hopefully you're aware that being alive is a really crucial point of life in general, but you know, whatever. Let's move on. How about we talk about, yes, who I would recommend read this book? Anyone who's alive. How about that? This is a work, like I said, of historical fiction. So if you like historical fiction, I would read this book. It's not historical fiction in the true sense in terms of, I tend to think of historical fiction as the author writing about historical facts. That's not that. He is writing about his current times. It's just history to us when this book takes place. I mentioned that I felt like this book was magical realism. It's not magical realism. What it is that he pushes the boundaries of what is real. The book is set up in a very realistic manner, and it's about things that he experienced in his own life and that kind of thing. But it is a work of fiction, and he pushes the fictional aspects of this um, further than you, the reader, may be comfortable with, especially if you like books that are based in realism. There is no magic happening in here, but there are some very fantastic and sort of like extreme things that happen in here that feel unbelievable. And some of them, he admits, are outright like unbelievable in terms of they would never happen in real life. But it'll be things like the number of people in a certain room or the way a certain like legal situation works out. Like they wouldn't literally work out in that example, but usually when that's happening, it's because he's combining a whole bunch of examples of things that have happened to multiple people and having them happen just to one person to make a point. So it all makes sense, and I felt like it made sense even as I read it, but it's one of those, if you get hung up in reading books on like that's not real, then just keep that in mind, that there is an aspect of this book that is going to feel like magical realism, and just like go with the flow. If you like plot-driven novels, or you like books that are character studies that are like very psychological and how they examine and explore and how you experience the characters, I think this would be a good book for that. If you're looking for a book that is exploring the Black experience, particularly during the time of Jim Crow laws, this is an excellent book for that, especially if you are maybe studying that for any reason in history. And I also think if you like books that talk about universal issues, especially the idea of belonging and the desire to live a good life, then this is an excellent book to read regarding all of those topics. If you are looking for other books that are like this or talk about things that are similar to this, I'm going to tell you about three. These are three that like constantly came up between me and my buddy reader while we were talking about this book, and I think are probably the three books I would say are most similar to it. And then I have a handful of other like fun fact books that you might want to consider if there's just certain parts of this book that you like. So I just remembered another one. So the first book, which I feel like in some ways is also the most obvious book, would be Invisible Man. Did you think I was going to say Black Boy? I'm going to mention that one as well, but I would actually say Invisible Man first. Invisible Man is by Ralph Ellison, and this is also about a Black man's experience of 1940s, but in this case, instead of Chicago, he is going from the South to New York City. And I would say this book is also very heavily symbolic, is pushing the limits of what's real in some ways, but this is definitely heavier on the symbolism. So if you liked Native Son, but you wanted more symbolism and more beautiful writing, give this a try. I will say that between the two books, I do like this one better. If you want to explore more of that idea of belonging and feeling like an outsider and looking at how the environment shapes who a person becomes, the best book I can think of for that would actually be Frankenstein. I know that the idea of Native Son and Frankenstein may seem very odd to some people, but if you've only read one of these books, trust me, if you read them both, I really think you'll see the connection there. Frankenstein has a lot to say about what it means to be human, what it means to create new life, and what responsibility we have to other beings to support and nurture the life and humanity in them, and what happens when we don't. There is, of course, always Crime and Punishment. I didn't bring my copy over here, and I'm not really going to say much about that because I haven't read that yet, but that is our next book club pick, so I'm excited to see how that goes and what connections I will find there. And then I already mentioned Black Boy. This is another work by Richard Wright. This is a work of nonfiction. So if you like his writing and you just want to read another work by him, but maybe something that is literally more about his life, I think you'll really enjoy this book. I find that even though this is nonfiction, I still think of it as the plotting in here is really well done, which is like it's something that you really can't say about nonfiction in some ways because it's his life, and he didn't plot his life, but it's so well plotted that it feels like he did. It's just the way he strings, the timeline of his life together feels like a well plotted novel, and I can see why because I think he's really good at plotting novels. Okay, so now going off the deep end to other things that I think you could read if you liked Native Son. And for each of these, I will give the loose connection that you may enjoy. Starting with pretty much anything by Tolstoy, especially if there's some crime involved, like in Resurrection. I think the way that Tolstoy goes about the internal dialogue and the psychology of his characters, him and Richard Wright have a lot in common. So I think if you enjoyed the inner dialogue and the psychology of Bigger Thomas in Native Son, I think you will also probably find you enjoy Tolstoy's writings and the way he explores the inner life of his characters. I think if you enjoyed some of the horrific aspects, that sounds weird to say that you would enjoy that, but if you found those parts well written, how about that? Because there were a couple of pretty like horrible and gruesome moments in Native Son that are horrifying and terrifying to think of, but were extremely well written and handled. I would suggest Edgar Allan Poe. It reminded me in those moments of Edgar Allan Poe's short stories, and it also reminded me of Hitchcock films. So if you think of the type of horror and gruesomeness that they bring into their stories or movies and how they do that, that's how it's going to feel in Native Son. So if you're familiar with those writers but maybe haven't read Native Son, might be a reason to give it a try. Another movie that came to mind that had to deal with like the symbolism and being blind to reality, which is something that comes up a lot in Native Son, would be the movie Matrix, which is all about sort of existing in a world that's not really the world that you're really in and not being part of the world that you're in and people around you being blind to the way that the world really is. Have you seen The Matrix? Do you know what I'm talking about? The Matrix and Native Son, they have that in common. In terms of looking at the prison system and criminality and what happens to people who are protesting in some manner, what is going on in society, I think two books that look at the topics in very similar manners would either be the fictional work Regeneration, which is looking at how a government and society can declare people insane or imprison people who they just politically disagree with or don't like what those people have to say, and it's a way of oppressing protesters. There is that in common with Native Man, and I think there is a similar pattern of being criminalized from birth in the book Born a Crime. And probably the oddest ball connection that my buddy reader and I made while reading this book was looking at the idea of whether or not imprisoning someone can be an act of mercy, and whether that is a just reaction to somebody who is not fitting in the world. We thought that that action happening in Native Son and being a conversation that came up in Native Son reminded us of Jane Eyre and how things were treated in there. And yeah, we had some Mr. Rochester moments. I'll just leave it at that. So that is it. Those are the two books that I read and the whole bunch of other books that I just felt like I had to mention in talking about them. So yeah, let me know if you've read any of these books and if you're interested in reading any of the other ones. And also, yeah, that's it. Have a great week. Happy reading. I'll talk to you next time. Bye.